Kalorama, a recorded book's hybrid imprint, presents Getting Russia Right, First Edition, by Thomas Graham. Read by Daniel Henning. Preface. Russia's massive invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, was a day of reckoning, for Russia, Ukraine, and the West, to be sure, but also, at a less exalted level, for all Russia experts, especially those, like me, who, up to the last moment, believed Russian President Vladimir Putin would take a less fateful route. Diplomatic talks had not run their course. A small-scale intervention, as in 2014, could have underscored his seriousness of purpose, tested Ukrainian and Western resolve, and helped assess the risks of further military action. Such steps seemed to be more in line with the pragmatic approach Putin had taken to most issues since he assumed power a generation ago. Alas, he decided to roll the dice. Why did so many experts get it wrong? Were their assumptions about Putin and Russia fatally flawed, or did they overlook a significant event that set Russia on an unlikely path? Beyond those immediate concerns loomed the larger question of how Russia and the United States had arrived at this point some 30 years after the Cold War's end, which had given birth to grand visions of enduring U.S.-Russian partnership in building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous world. That question was of particular salience for someone like me who had been studying Russia for most of his life. The Sputnik moment in 1957 that convinced the United States to radically elevate its response to the Soviet challenge also sparked my lifelong fascination with Russia. Finding the answer was a matter of professional pride for someone whose career as a Russia expert began during the dying days of the Cold War. I entered U.S. government service in 1983 and spent 20 years working on Soviet and then Russian affairs at the American Embassy in Moscow, in the Departments of State and Defense, and on the National Security Council staff, including 3 years as the Senior Director for Russia. Since I left government in February 2007, I've continued to work on Russian matters as a consultant, teacher, and researcher. For the last 35 years, I've either lived in Moscow or traveled to Russia regularly for meetings with senior Russian government officials, business people, media representatives, experts, students, and others. My positions and travels have provided various perches from which to observe the evolution of U.S.-Russian relations since the last years of the Cold War. During the George W. Bush administration, I was directly involved in the formation of U.S.-Russia policy, although I was never more than a second-tier player who will not merit even a footnote in the history books. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was time to take a critical look at the post-Cold War history of U.S.-Russian relations and the quality of U.S. policymaking, with the hope that the lessons learned would help the United States better deal with the Russia challenge in the future. Thus, this book. Despite my government service, this book is not a brief in defense of any administration's policy. To the contrary, I turn a critical eye to all post-Cold War administrations, with a focus more on the shortcomings than the successes. Nor is this book a lament that administrations did not take my advice on the overall approach to Russia or on specific matters. Nowhere do I argue that relations would have turned out better if senior officials had done so. I've suffered my own share of misperceptions, blind spots, and illusions, which become all the more stark in retrospect. Rather, my goal throughout has been to understand what I've witnessed during the past 3 to 4 decades, with a particular focus on U.S. policy. Policy is always made in a situation of imperfect knowledge. As a rule, policymakers are compelled to act before they have a full understanding of the issue at hand. This is always the case during a crisis. To a lesser extent, it is true of strategic planning as well. Policymakers have blind spots, They lack critical information about the target country of the policymaking. No outsider can fully appreciate the often subterranean forces that shape a country's destiny, and, truth be told, few natives do, although their intuition is usually more accurate. This is the natural state of things. The policymaker has no reason to complain. As Henry Kissinger has noted, there is an inverse relationship between influence and certainty. The policymaker often has the greatest opportunity to shape events when much is uncertain. Waiting for more information can diminish influence. This is not a plea for hasty judgments and actions. It is rather to note that the art of statesmanship requires a keen sense for the moment when the statesman has sufficient knowledge to act decisively, and when waiting for its further accumulation begins to erode his influence. That intuition comes from experience and the study of history. It requires distilling out of a complex situation the essence that enables purposeful action. In this sense, essentialism, so suspect in academic circles, is a necessary aspect of policymaking. Complexity paralyzes the will, which is one reason why few academics adjust well to the policy world. Policymakers need to simplify reality to a manageable degree, and they necessarily operate on the basis of what they consider to be a few essential truths about world affairs, the country they serve, and the foreign lands they deal with. As Bismarck eloquently put it, the statesman's task is to hear God's footsteps marching through history and to try and catch on to his coat-tails as he marches past. Success depends on whether he hears those footsteps clearly through the noise of a turbulent world. Critics will object that I've painted with too broad a brush in this book, that I've left out nuance. This is indeed the case. But my goal was not to provide an exhaustive examination of U.S. policy, Russian national interests, and U.S.-Russian relations. It was to distill the few key ideas that have shaped policy and the critical forces that have driven events, to provide a framework for understanding Russia, which, it is hoped, will help future policymakers advance U.S. interests in relations with that country. Cold War containment, widely praised as an historic triumph, the critics should remember, was grounded in a few essential truths about Russia and the United States, first articulated by the American diplomat George F. Kennan in his long telegram from the embassy in Moscow to the Department of State in 1946. In the end, policymaking is always haunted by regrets. In retrospect, policymakers should always have done better if they'd known then what they know now. But the owl of Minerva takes flight only at dusk, the great German philosopher Hegel observed. Understanding comes only when it is too late to act. The best one can do is to pass that belated understanding on to the next generation of policymakers in the hope that they will know how to use it. Introduction. The United States and Russia are once again adversaries. This is not where either country wanted to be some 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War. Back then, both countries harbored visions of partnership, although they sought it for different reasons. The United States hoped to integrate Russia into the Euro-Atlantic community of free market democracies. That would seal the American victory in the Cold War and vindicate its system, much as the emergence of liberal democracy in Germany and Japan under American tutelage had after their defeats in the Second World War. Russia, meanwhile, sought to use partnership to restore its status as the second leading global power, if not exactly the other superpower. Whether it was democratic or authoritarian was of little intrinsic interest as long as it was powerful. So, the destinations were distant from one another, and yet both Washington and Moscow believed the path to their respective goals lay through partnership. After a quarter-century of failed efforts to build a lasting partnership, followed by several years of mounting tensions, Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, crystallized a profound alienation between Russia and the United States. Relations today are scraping the depths of Cold War antagonisms. Indeed, they've probably not been so hostile since 1983, the darkest year of the second half of the Cold War. Then-President Ronald Reagan denounced the Soviet Union as the evil empire and launched his Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars, as it was quickly dubbed, which questioned the principles that undergirded strategic stability, much to Moscow's alarm. The Soviets shot down a South Korean commercial airliner in the Far East, killing all on board. When the United States protested in the strongest terms, Moscow broke off arms control negotiations. On at least 2 occasions in the fall, the world came close to nuclear war, once because of a technical glitch in the Soviet early warning system, then because the Soviet leaders feared that a regular NATO nuclear launch exercise was merely cover for a decapitating strike against the Soviet Union. No Cold War redux, but dangers abound. Against this background, it is easy to see the current situation as Cold War 2.0, and to turn to that era for insight into the current U.S.-Russian dynamic and guidance on the appropriate response. That the United States won the original Cold War makes the analogy all the more appealing to policymakers, experts, and the public alike. But the Cold War frame obscures as much as it illuminates, and it favors policies that are out of sync with current circumstances. Containment, for example, cannot describe an adequate policy in a multipolar, interconnected world when key countries, notably China and India, are unwilling to follow the U.S. lead. The original Cold War was of different dimensions. It was a global existential struggle between the world's 2 superpowers, which espoused diametrically opposed views of the state, society, and individual. Each ultimately built nuclear arsenals capable of devastating its rivals several times over. Each headed its own bloc, with major allies or satellites in Europe and East Asia. Soviet-American relations were the central axis of global politics around which other countries oriented their foreign policies. Not surprisingly, in this light, the Soviet Union lay at the core of American foreign policy. All major foreign policy challenges were assessed through the prism of Soviet-American relations. Nothing close to those conditions obtains today. U.S.-Russian rivalry is not truly global in scope. It is focused on Europe. It is not existential, except in the nuclear realm. The 2 countries do not espouse diametrically opposed worldviews, despite President Joseph Biden's defining the current era as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, or President Vladimir Putin's claiming to be the champion of traditional Christian values against Western decadence. A vast asymmetry in power robs the relationship of the centrality it once enjoyed in world affairs and on the American foreign policy agenda. China now occupies the place the Soviet Union once did in Washington's imagination as the sole peer strategic competitor for global leadership. Russia is dismissed as an immediate and persistent threat. It is hard to conduct a Cold War against a country you do not respect or fear. To be sure, as Robert Legvold, a leading Russia watcher, argues, the current U.S.-Russian confrontation bears attributes of the Cold War. As during that earlier period, each side regards the confrontation as the exclusive fault of the other side. Since the battle is over conflicting purposes, neither side is looking for common ground, and each believes that the contest can only end with radical change on the other side, or its collapse. Moreover, agreements do not have a positive effect on other areas of relations, while conflict tends to spread poison elsewhere. The Biden administration's national security strategy, released in October 2022, exhibits all those attributes in its discussion of Russia. It makes clear that Russia spurned American offers of more constructive relations and holds out little hope for improvement as long as Putin is in power. Yet the Biden administration, rightly, refuses to talk of a Cold War, even if its policy of hard-edged containment draws inspiration from that earlier time. It prefers to speak of great power competition, as did the Trump administration previously. But the U.S.-Russian rivalry is more than just normal great power competition, largely because of the way in which the United States deals with major competitors. In general, it does not recognize geopolitical rivalry that is not grounded in diverging systems of values. The Ukraine conflict provides an apt illustration. For the Russian elite, it is fundamentally geopolitical. At its core lies the question of Russia's security and power. Even if Putin entertains some curious ideas about making Russia whole again by reabsorbing Ukraine. Washington, however, rejects this security dimension out of hand, insisting that neither Ukraine nor NATO could be reasonably seen as threatening Russia. Rather, it frames the conflict as a manifestation of aggressive Russian imperialism, grounded in its autocratic political system. Moscow believes that the United States is out to crush it because it cannot abide Russian power, while Washington is seeking to contain what it sees as Russia's malign ideas and impulses by eroding its power. Moscow's geopolitical contest is ultimately an ideological one for Washington. There is no common ground between these two positions, no room for compromise. To say that the United States and Russia are not engaged in a new Cold War does not mean that the situation is not dangerous or without far-reaching consequences. Russia may be much weaker than the Soviet Union was, and its unexpectedly dismal performance in the initial months of the Ukraine conflict only underscores that point, but it still has considerable power. Its nuclear arsenal is the world's largest. It can still destroy the United States as a functioning society in as little as 30 minutes. It has the largest reserves of fossil fuels, which will power the world for years to come, even as the West and others press ahead in the development of green technologies. Its location in the heart of Eurasia enables it to project power and pathologies into the world's major strategic regions outside of North America. The risk of nuclear war once again focuses minds in Washington as Moscow rattles its nuclear saber in the face of deteriorating battlefield conditions in Ukraine. Global energy markets are in the midst of dramatic change as Europe seeks to end its excessive reliance on Russia and accelerates its move to renewables, while the United States steps in hopes of becoming a major supplier of both gas and oil to European markets. Sweden and Finland, with Washington's encouragement, have broken with their long-standing tradition of neutrality to join NATO, as concerns about Russian aggression mount. U.S. policy is driving Russia into an even closer embrace of China. The U.S.-led rules-based world order is breaking under the strain of a shifting strategic landscape. No new global equilibrium is apparent on the horizon. The world is a dangerous place, and it is so in part because of the breakdown in U.S.-Russian relations. The plan of the book. How did we get to this point? Where do we go from here? Those are the two questions that animate this book. The subject is U.S.-Russian relations since the end of the Cold War. This book is not a history. Rather, it is a critique of America's post-Cold War Russia policy through 6 administrations, beginning with George H.W. Bush's and ending with Joseph Biden's, with a particular focus on the grand strategy of ingratiating Russia into the West, which began in the dying days of the Cold War and ended abruptly in March 2014, when Putin's Russia seized and annexed Crimea illegally. The book ends with an appeal to think about relations beyond the current conflict in Ukraine, to consider ways in which the United States could construct relations with Russia to best advance its interests long-term, as a period of historic change gives rise to a new world order. The book makes two core claims: that to defend its long-term strategic interests, the United States must treat Russia as a great power, which entails, as all great power relationships do, making trade-offs and compromises to manage the inevitable competition responsibly. And that the integration model, the premise that Russia could join the West, ultimately failed because it was, and remains, incompatible with the deeply held national aspirations and policy imperatives of both the United States and Russia. To expand slightly, the initial American post-Cold War goal of integrating Russia into the Euro-Atlantic community as a free market democracy and building an enduring partnership was doomed from the start. Clashing worldviews and national missions grounded in geography, geopolitical circumstances, and historical experience, which could never be fully reconciled, inevitably injected a lasting element of tension in relations, which was exacerbated by U.S. actions and Russian reactions. But there was nothing foreordained about the depths of antagonism that divide the two countries today. There was another pathway forward, toward, if not strategic partnership, then more constructive relations of mutual benefit, which would have required the United States to respect Russia as a great power. Taking it would have, however, required greater clarity of vision, imagination, and political will than successive American administrations could muster at the time. Now, Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine has radically altered the context of U.S.-Russian relations, as have the dramatic geopolitical, technological, and other changes underway across the globe. Looking forward, the United States faces a twofold challenge: defeating the Russian assault on the European order in the short term, while preparing the ground for relations that will enable the United States to interact with Russia as a major pole of power in the emerging polycentric world, to construct and sustain a long-term complex global equilibrium, and to deal with transnational threats. The argument unfolds across 7 chapters. Chapter 1 begins with an examination of the foundations of U.S.-Russia policy. Why did the United States decide to focus on Russia's integration at the end of the Cold War? Why did it believe that a country with a long autocratic tradition could successfully make a transition to free market democracy in a relatively short historical period? Why did it believe that a country that prided itself on being a great power would willingly become a junior partner in supporting a U.S.-led world order? How did it hedge against the failure of its preferred course? And did the hedges ironically increase the risk of failure? The answers are found in the euphoria that swept over the American political class after the triumph in the Cold War, which was a vindication of the American system and a confirmation of its universal applicability. An historical exegesis follows in Chapter 2 to identify the sources of the inherent tension in U.S.-Russian relations that has repeatedly bedeviled efforts to build an enduring partnership. In brief, geography and geopolitical setting shaped over time competing American and Russian concepts of security requirements and national purpose. Russia expanded in search of security on a vast territory with few formidable physical barriers against foreign invasion. The United States expanded from its most secure position in North America to spread its universal values and nourish its prosperity. Russia was determined to maintain its own unique identity as a great power. The United States hoped to transform the world in its image. Those opposing goals inevitably produced friction, and these two expansionary powers came into ever more frequent contact on the Eurasian supercontinent from the end of the 19th century onwards. Chapter 3 explores the question of Russian power. It lays out the reason why the United States has considered Russia to be a country in decline, destined to lose its status as a great power, if it had not already done so, and to play an even lesser role in world affairs. That attitude has led American administrations to conclude that they need not pay much heed to Russian interests. The chapter then assesses the state of Russian power today with a focus on the economic, technological, demographic, and political challenges the country faces in coming years as it seeks to sustain itself as a world power. The paradoxical conclusion is that even a Russia in decline will long retain the capacity to act as a major power, to advance or thwart American interests in critical areas, and therefore remains a country that Washington cannot afford to ignore. 2 chapters follow on Russia's views of its national interests and foreign policy challenges. Chapter 4 identifies the preservation of the state and Russia as a great power as the historically grounded core national interest. It traces the steps Russia has taken at home and abroad since the end of the Cold War to validate its great power status. It highlights the challenges posed by Russia's geopolitical position and analyzes the changing ways in which Russia has sought to meet them. In particular, it looks at the developments that led the Kremlin to abandon the effort to build a partnership with the United States in favor of seeking strategic alignment with China as the best way to bolster its claim to be a great power. Chapter 5 is devoted to the Ukraine crisis, providing a brief overview of the historical background that has convinced Russia of the importance of Ukraine to Russian identity and security as a leading power. It also takes a close look at Putin's own views and the calculations that led him to launch a massive invasion of Ukraine. The argument is that while any Russian ruler would have been alarmed by developments in and around Ukraine, few would have run the risk of war at this time, as Putin has. In short, it is more Putin's war than Russia's. That is an important conclusion that should affect the way the United States approaches the war in Ukraine and long-term relations with Russia. Chapters 1 to 5 lay the groundwork for assessing the quality of U.S.-Russia policy since the end of the Cold War in Chapter 6. It shows why certain U.S. policies discredited the very idea of integration in Russian eyes, and how a lack of imagination led the United States to hedge against Russia's failure to integrate in ways that increased the likelihood of failure. Indeed, the chapter concludes that excessively vigorous hedging against the reassertion of Russian influence in the former Soviet space caused relations to break down in 2014, when Putin pushed back by seizing Crimea and destabilizing eastern Ukraine. Thereafter, however, it was not U.S. policy, but Putin's aggressive conduct, culminating in the massive invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that produced the complete rupture that characterizes relations today. As for lessons learned, Chapter 6 focuses on those that arise from Russia's insistence that it is and must be respected as a great power. It will reject any interference in its domestic affairs. It will always be tough in negotiations, presenting its own unique views on global issues, and it will be tenacious in the defense of its interests in the former Soviet space, where it views its preeminence as critical to its security and prosperity. It also underscores the importance of strategic patience, of managing relations with Russia so as to advance American interests incrementally over time. The final chapter, 7, deals with the inevitable question: what is to be done? On the basis of an analysis of global trends and Russian developments, as well as the lessons of the past 30 years, it underscores why the United States benefits from a Russia strong enough to play a major role in world affairs, with a focus on 3 critical issues: strategic stability, European security, and China. It ends with a proposal on how to approach the conflict in Ukraine that supports the long-term strategy while building toward an enduring and just settlement. Understanding Russia in its own terms. To get Russia policy right, it is critical that the United States has a clear understanding of that country, of its fears and ambitions. This is not an easy task. Russian writers have reveled in the mystery of their country, its ability to play a large role in human affairs, despite the seemingly debilitating contradictions of Russian life, the opulence of the court and the grinding poverty elsewhere, economic backwardness and spectacular military victories, harsh...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?